The date was April 20th, 2025. In the high, jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada, the air should have been softening with the arrival of spring, but the mountains were keeping a deadly secret. Tiffany Slaton, a 28-year-old dialysis technician from Georgia, was moving calmly through the Sierra National Forest on her electric bike, towing a small trailer filled with the simple comforts of a 3-day solo vacation. She was an experienced outdoors woman, a competitive archer, and a woman who understood the mechanics of the human body better than most. To Tiffany, this was a routine birthday trek near Huntington Lake, a way to find silence before another year of life began. She had her tent, 2 sleeping bags, and a special treat tucked away for the final night, a pack of Dunkaroos that she planned to eat as a makeshift birthday cake. But in the wilderness, normalcy is a fragile mask that nature can tear away in a heartbeat. As she navigated a narrow trail, the world beneath her tires suddenly vanished. A massive shelf of snow, destabilized by the fluctuating spring temperatures, gave way in a silent, terrifying rush. It wasn't just a slide, it was an avalanche that swept Tiffany and her gear off the edge of a sheer cliff. For 2 hours, she lay crumpled at the bottom of a ravine, buried in the white silence of unconsciousness. When her eyes finally flickered open, the serene mountain landscape had transformed into a visceral nightmare of pain and isolation. She tried to move, but her body screamed in a language she understood all too well from her medical training. Her right knee was visibly displaced, bulging at an impossible angle, and her left leg was fractured, the bones shivering under the skin. She was alone in one of the most unforgiving places in North America, and the sun was already beginning to dip behind the 11,000-foot peaks, casting long blue shadows across the snow that would soon turn into a freezer. Most people, faced with the sight of their own shattered limbs in a wilderness void, would have succumbed to the suffocating weight of panic. But Tiffany Slaton was not most people. She looked at her legs not with horror, but with the cold, calculated eye of a technician assessing a failing machine. She knew that if she didn't reset the joint immediately, the swelling would soon make it impossible, cutting off circulation and ensuring she would never walk out of these mountains. With a guttural cry that was swallowed by the indifferent pines, she gripped her own leg and popped her knee back into its socket. The agony was blinding, a white-hot flash that threatened to send her back into the darkness of a faint, but she forced herself to stay awake. She then took a trekking pole and strips of her own shirt, fashioning a primitive but effective splint for her fractured leg. It was the first act of a biological war she would wage for the next 24 days. She reached for her phone, desperate to close the loop of this disaster before the cold set in. 5 times she dialed 911, watching the signal bars remain stubbornly empty as the call failed again and again. The GPS was haywire, unable to pin her location in the deep shadow of the canyon. In a moment of sheer, frustrated absurdity, the kind that only happens when the mind is pushed to its brink, she stopped trying to find a map and instead asked the voice assistant for the location of the nearest Starbucks. To her shock, the phone blinked to life, indicating a location 18 miles away. It was a digital ghost, a tether to a civilization that felt like it existed on another planet. She knew retracing her path was impossible. The avalanche had erased the road and left a wall of debris in its wake. Her only choice was to move forward, deeper into the backcountry, toward a destination that her logic told her she might never reach. The silence of the Sierra Nevada is not peaceful when you are broken and bleeding. It is the sound of a tomb waiting to be filled. As the first of 13 snowstorms began to gather on the horizon, Tiffany realized her situation had shifted from a crisis to a siege. Her tent was gone, lost in the tumble down the cliff. Her e-bike, the engine of her mobility, was a useless skeleton of metal abandoned at a trailhead. She was standing in 10 feet of snow with a makeshift splint and a dying phone, 4,300 miles of rugged terrain separating her from the search teams that hadn't even been formed yet. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have curled into the snow and waited for the end? Or would you have started to crawl? Tiffany chose the latter, treating her survival not as a matter of hope, but as a technical problem that required a series of brutal, necessary solutions. Would you have made the same choice, knowing that every step was a gamble with a deck stacked by the freezing wind? This was no longer a vacation. It was the beginning of a harrowing journey through the White Death, where the only thing thinner than the air was the line between a miracle and a tragedy. Tiffany looked at the mountains and saw a biological engine that needed fuel, and she was prepared to harvest whatever the earth offered to keep it running. But the mountains were just getting started, and the first storm was about to hit. Would you have the willpower to reset your own shattered limb in total isolation, or would the silence of the wilderness break you before the cold even had a chance? Imagine your 28th birthday cake is a single pack of Dunkaroos, saved for 24 days while you waited to die in a frozen cabin at the edge of the world. For Tiffany Slaton, those cookies weren't just a snack. They were the final trophy of a woman who had been hunted by the Sierra Nevada for nearly a month. She wasn't just lost in the woods. She was broken, stranded with a snapped leg and a dislocated knee that she had to reset herself while the ground beneath her still groaned from a recent avalanche. 13 separate snowstorms howled across the peaks, burying the world in 12 feet of white death, leaving Tiffany to choose between becoming a seasonal statistic or a walking miracle. We are going beyond the viral headlines of the Leak Girl to reconstruct a journey that defies every law of wilderness survival. While a massive search operation scrambled across 4,300 miles of brutal terrain and 11,000-foot peaks, Tiffany was existing on a diet of wild leeks and boiled snow, maintaining a journal to keep the encroaching madness at bay. But as the world celebrated her rescue, a darker curiosity ignited the internet. How does a human being survive the impossible for 24 days and emerge with only a 10-pound weight loss? The answers lie in the visceral reality of those 24 days. We have to ask why her phone, in a moment of life or death desperation, suggested a Starbucks 18 miles away instead of connecting to a 911 operator. We need to understand how a traveling dialysis technician used her clinical medical training to splint her own skeletal system in the middle of a literal disaster zone. This is a story of grit, strange technology, and the savage beauty of a mountain range that tried to swallow a woman whole. What would you have done if the only thing between you and a frozen grave was a handful of bitter roots and the sheer will to see your next birthday? The silence that follows a traumatic impact is never truly quiet. For Tiffany, it was a heavy, ringing vibration that seemed to pulse from the very granite she lay pressed against. When her eyes finally flickered open, the world was a blur of gray stone and blinding white snow, spinning in a slow, sickening carousel. She had been unconscious for 2 hours, a dangerous eternity in a landscape where the temperature was already beginning its nightly plummet. The air smelled of wet earth and pulverized pine needles, a sharp medicinal scent that cut through her fog. She tried to move, but a white-hot spear of agony shot from her lower body directly to her skull, pinning her back against the debris. Looking down, the visceral reality of her situation became terrifyingly clear. Her left leg was bent at an angle that defied human anatomy, the knee joint visibly displaced under her hiking pants. Most people would have succumbed to the rising tide of panic, but the clinical mind of a dialysis technician began to override the primal fear of the victim. She knew that if she didn't reset that joint immediately, the swelling would lock it in place, cutting off circulation and ensuring she would never walk again. Gritting her teeth until they felt ready to shatter, she gripped her thigh and her calf, drawing a breath that tasted of ice and desperation. With a guttural scream that was swallowed instantly by the indifferent peaks, she slammed the bone back into its socket. The sound of the joint popping home was sickeningly loud in the thin mountain air. But the ordeal was far from over. Her other leg was fractured, the bone unstable beneath the skin. Using the sharp edge of her survival knife, she began to tear strips from her own shirt, her fingers trembling with a mix of shock and adrenaline. She scavenged a fallen trekking pole from the edge of the slide, bracing it against her shattered limb and winding the fabric tight, creating a makeshift splint in the dirt. It was a crude piece of field medicine, but it was the only thing keeping her skeletal system from collapsing entirely. The cliff she had tumbled over was now an impassable wall of jagged rock and ice, and the path behind her was obliterated by the heavy, suffocating weight of a fresh avalanche. She was trapped in a topographical dead end, a natural cage of granite and snow. She reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button with a sliver of hope. 5 times she attempted to reach 911, and 5 times the screen mocked her with the words, "No service." The silence of the Sierra Nevada is not just a lack of sound. It is a physical weight, a reminder that you are no longer at the top of the food chain. She was 28 years old, broken, and completely alone in a 600-square-mile wilderness. The e-bike, her tent, and the bulk of her heavy gear were gone, buried somewhere under the white shroud of the slide. All she had left was her journal, her medical kit, and a stubborn refusal to die in the shadows. What would you have done if you woke up to find your legs broken and your lifeline to the world severed? Tiffany didn't wait for an answer from the mountains. She began to crawl. The date was April 20th, 2025, and the Sierra Nevada was supposed to be a playground, not a tomb. Tiffany Slaton, a 28-year-old competitive archer from the rolling hills of Georgia, pulled into the Huntington Lake trailhead with the kind of confidence only an expert outdoorswoman possesses. She had an electric bike, a trailer packed with gear, and 2 heavy-duty sleeping bags designed for a spring that usually brought blooming manzanita. In her pack sat a small plastic container of Dunkaroos, cookies with vanilla frosting, which she had earmarked as her birthday cake for the following week. It was a simple, mundane treat that represented her timeline, a sugary anchor to the world of the living. She expected a 3-day solo vacation, a brief escape into the high country to test her grit against the granite peaks. But the Sierra was trapped in a winter that wouldn't end, and the mountains were holding their breath. Tiffany felt the bite of the air as she began her ascent, the hum of her e-bike motor the only sound in the vast white cathedral of the pines. She was a dialysis technician by trade, a woman who understood the fragile mechanics of the human body and the precision required to keep it running. As she pushed higher toward Shaver Lake, the spring she expected vanished under 10 feet of stubborn, pack-hardened snow. The trail didn't just end, it failed, crumbling under the weight of a season that refused to let go. Then, the mountain spoke. It started as a low vibration in her boots, a deep tectonic growl that vibrated through the frame of her bike. Within seconds, the roar became absolute. An avalanche, triggered by the shifting weight of a late-season thaw, came thundering down the slope with the force of a freight train. The world suddenly tilted. Tiffany didn't have time to scream before the white wall slammed into her, sweeping her e-bike, her trailer, and her body off the edge of a sheer cliff. The descent was a violent blur of pulverized pine needles and jagged granite. She felt the sickening snap of bone as she tumbled, a sound that was instantly swallowed by the white chaos. Then, there was nothing but the heavy, terrifying silence of the snow settling over her. For 2 hours, Tiffany lay unconscious in the belly of the mountain, her breath shallow and her body cooling toward the ambient temperature of the ice. When she finally opened her eyes, the mountains weren't a vacation anymore. They were a predator, and she was already in its jaws. The smell of torn timber and cold earth filled her nostrils, and as she looked down at her mangled legs, the visceral reality of her situation began to sink in. She was alone, broken, and buried in a wilderness that had just tried to kill her. Would you have had the strength to look at your own shattered limbs and decide to fight? Tiffany reached for her pack, her fingers brushing the plastic lid of the Dunkaroos, and realized her birthday was still days away. She wasn't ready to let the Sierra have the final word. The internal clock of a survivor is a fragile thing, ticking away in the silence between the howling Sierra winds. Tiffany realized that if she were to survive the coming weeks, she couldn't just exist as a victim. She had to become a resident of the void. Her world had shrunk to the 4 feet of frozen ground immediately surrounding her, and every movement was a calculated risk against her own dwindling reserves. The fracture in her leg throbbed with a rhythmic, sickening heat, that contrasted sharply with the biting air. Yet she knew that to stop moving was to invite the frost to claim her for good. She began to establish a brutal domestic routine within the chaos of the granite peaks. This was no longer a vacation. It was a job where the only salary was another hour of breath. Her horticultural training, once a point of professional pride, now became her literal lifeline as she scoured the thinning tree line. She found them beneath the crust of the spring snow, wild leeks, their pungent, earthy scent cutting through the sterile smell of the ice. They were bitter and stringy, a far cry from a balanced meal, but to Tiffany, they represented a defiant victory over the starvation that was already beginning to hollow out her cheeks. But nature has a way of mocking human effort just when you think you've gained a foothold. As she gathered the small green shoots, the sky above Kaiser Pass began to bruise into a deep, heavy purple. The 13th snowstorm of her ordeal was rolling in, a wall of white that threatened to erase the very ground she stood on. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed through the pines, a deafening roar that made it impossible to hear her own thoughts. She huddled under a lean-to of frozen branches, clutching a cup of manzanita tea she had brewed over a struggling flame. The warmth was fleeting, a ghost of a sensation that vanished the moment the liquid left her throat. She reached for her journal, her fingers stiff and blue, and began to write. The ink skipped on the damp pages, but the act of recording her survival was the only thing keeping the madness at bay. In the silence of the high Sierra, loneliness is a bigger enemy than hunger, and the mind starts to invent voices just to fill the space. She found herself talking to the trees, apologizing to her parents in the empty air, and wondering if anyone was even looking for her anymore. The search teams were out there, covering thousands of miles, but from her vantage point at 9,000 feet, the world was a white tomb. She looked at her splinted leg, the fabric of her shirt now gray with grime and old blood, and felt a wave of pure, unadulterated despair. It's easy to talk about resilience when you're warm, but would you have had the will to keep foraging when every bite of a wild leek felt like swallowing a reminder of your own desperation? Just as the sun began to dip behind the jagged horizon, Tiffany saw something that stopped her heart. A flicker of light far in the distance, nestled in the crook of a valley she hadn't yet reached. It was too steady to be a star, and too golden to be the moon. For a second, hope flared in her chest like a physical pain. But the Sierra was not done with her yet, and the path to that light lay across a pass buried under 12 feet of unforgiving powder. Although her body was screaming for rest, Tiffany knew that if she stayed here, the birthday cake she had saved would be eaten by the wind. She had to move, even if it meant crawling through the teeth of the storm. The darkness of unconsciousness didn't fade so much as it cracked, split apart by the searing cold of the Sierra Nevada snow pressing against Tiffany's cheek. For 2 hours, the world had ceased to exist. But as her eyes fluttered open, the visceral reality of her situation rushed back with the force of a physical blow. She tried to shift her weight, expecting the routine protest of stiff muscles, but instead, a white-hot spike of agony shot from her lower body directly into her brain. She looked down, and the sight was enough to make even a seasoned medical professional lose their breath. Her right knee was not where it should have been. It was twisted at a sickening, impossible angle, pointing toward the canyon wall while her foot remained trapped in the slush. Her other leg felt heavy and numb, a dull throb suggesting a fracture that was currently hidden beneath her hiking pants. Tiffany was a dialysis technician, used to the sight of blood and the mechanics of the human body, but seeing her own skeleton rearranged in the dirt was a different kind of horror. The wind howled through the granite peaks, a reminder that the temperature was dropping and no one was coming to help her. She knew that if that joint stayed displaced, the swelling would soon make it impossible to move, and the lack of blood flow could cost her the limb before the sun even set. She took a deep breath, the frozen air burning her lungs, and gripped her thigh with both hands. It was a moment of pure, agonizing necessity. With a guttural scream that was swallowed instantly by the mountain peaks, Tiffany threw her weight into the joint, forcing the bone back into its socket. The sound was a wet, heavy thud that vibrated through her entire frame, a sickening pop that echoed against the silent trees. For a moment, the world turned gray, her vision tunneling as the shock threatened to pull her back into the blackness. But the knee was seated. It was back. She couldn't afford to faint again. Moving with the frantic precision of someone who knows their minutes are numbered, she reached for her gear, or what was left of it. Her trekking pole had survived the tumble, and she gripped it like a lifeline. She began tearing strips from her own shirt, the fabric stubborn against her shaking fingers, and began the grim task of tying the rigid pole to her fractured leg. Every wrap of the cloth was a fresh wave of pain, but she cinched it tight, creating a primitive splint that would have to carry her across miles of vertical wilderness. Once her body was stabilized, she reached for the one thing that connects a modern human to safety, her phone. Her fingers were becoming unresponsive, turning a waxy blue as she fumbled with the screen. She dialed 911. The call hung in the air, a silent plea sent into the atmosphere before the screen flashed the words that feel like a death sentence in the backcountry. No service. She tried again, and again. 5 times she watched the signal bars remain hollow, a digital void that matched the empty horizon. Then, a strange glitch occurred, a moment of technological surrealism that would later become a hallmark of her story. The GPS suddenly flickered to life, but it didn't show a ranger station or a trailhead. Instead, the screen offered a bizarre suggestion: a Starbucks, located 18 miles away. Friends, imagine you are looking at your phone, your only link to humanity, and it tells you to get a latte while your bone is splintered in the snow. It was a cruel joke played by an algorithm that didn't understand the Sierra Nevada. Yet as she looked back at the path she had come from, she saw the massive wall of avalanche debris that had cut off her retreat. The way back was a tomb of shattered pines and ice. The Starbucks logic, as absurd as it was, pointed forward, toward a map coordinate that at least suggested the presence of people. She realized in that moment that she was officially off the grid, a ghost in the machine. No one knew she had fallen. No one knew she was broken. The descent into the psychological grind had begun, and her only compass was a phantom coffee shop in the middle of a frozen hell. By day 5, the last of the store-bought calories were gone. The small bag of trail mix and the energy bars that were supposed to last a long weekend had vanished, leaving Tiffany with nothing but a gnawing, hollow ache in her stomach. In the Sierra, hunger isn't a feeling, it's a clock, and Tiffany was listening to every tick. Most people in this situation would have panicked, but Tiffany's horticultural training became her silent savior. She began to scrape away the heavy, wet snow with her bare, numb fingers, searching for the telltale signs of the wild leek. Finding them was a navigation miracle in itself, but she knew that without these bitter, onion-like stalks, her organs would begin to shut down within a week. Every morning became a clinical ritual of survival. She didn't just eat, she medicated herself with the forest. She gathered manzanita leaves and bright green pine needles, brewing a pungent, acidic tea over her small stove. It was a visceral reality of wilderness medicine. The pine needles provided a massive hit of vitamin C to ward off scurvy, while the manzanita acted as a mild diuretic and antiseptic. This wasn't a hobby anymore. It was a wild leek pharmacy. She was driving on the rims of her physical endurance, but her mind remained sharp, focused on the chemistry of her own blood. But the body is only half the battle in an unforgiving place like Kaiser Pass. To fight the creeping onset of the madness, Tiffany turned to her journal. Every single day, she forced her frozen hand to move across the paper, writing to her parents and dreaming of her home in Georgia. As the 13 snowstorms hammered her position, the handwriting in that journal tells the true story of her deterioration. The early entries are neat, precise, technical notes of a dialysis technician. By the second week, the letters become jagged, sprawling across the page as her core temperature fluctuated and her grip strength failed. She wrote until the ink nearly froze, using the paper as an anchor to reality when the whiteout conditions threatened to dissolve the world around her. Then came the moment of ultimate calculation. She looked at her e-bike, the heavy trailer, and her soaked tent. They were tools of comfort, but now they were anchors dragging her toward the grave. In a move that many armchair experts would call a fatal error, she decided to abandon it all. She left the bike at a trailhead sign, a metal skeleton that marked the spot where her old life ended. She kept nothing but her splinted leg, her journal, and her willpower. She was stripping herself down to the absolute minimum required to stay alive, a lone figure crawling through 10 feet of snow, chasing the ghost of a rescue that felt further away with every agonizing step. Would you have been able to leave your only shelter behind, knowing that the next storm was already darkening the horizon? Tiffany didn't have the luxury of doubt. She only had the next leak, the next cup of tea, and the next line in her diary. The climb to Kaiser Pass was not a hike, it was a slow-motion battle against a vertical world of white. At 11,000 feet, the air becomes a thin, taunting ghost that refuses to fill the lungs. And for Tiffany, every breath felt like a jagged blade of ice. She was navigating snowdrifts 12 feet deep, a height that could swallow a house, let alone a woman with a shattered leg. Her splint, fashioned from a trekking pole and strips of her own clothing, was a clumsy anchor in the soft powder. It snagged on hidden branches and dragged through the drifts, forcing her to heave her entire body weight forward with every step. The sheer impossibility of this ascent cannot be overstated. A person with a broken leg and a dislocated knee should not be able to summit a mountain pass in the dead of a Sierra winter. But the human will is a strange, stubborn engine that runs on a fuel the body doesn't know it has. The weather was no longer an obstacle. It had become her constant, violent companion. Over the course of her journey, Tiffany would endure 13 distinct snowstorms, each one a localized apocalypse of wind and frost. The routine of survival became a rhythmic, desperate ceremony. Every evening she would hunker down and begin the process of boiling snow. It sounds simple, but in a world where everything is frozen, fire is a miracle that must be coaxed from the damp earth. She needed that warm liquid in her belly not just for hydration, but to keep her core temperature from plummeting into the kill zone. The steam from the pot was the only warmth she knew, a fleeting ghost of comfort in a landscape that wanted her heart to stop. As she climbed higher, her body began to pay the price of the constant moisture and the unrelenting cold. The skin on her hands, once soft and capable, started to crack and peel like old parchment, the deep fissures stinging every time she gripped her makeshift crutch. But the true horror was hidden inside her boots. Trench foot is a silent rot, a condition where the flesh begins to die because it never has the chance to dry. Her feet were no longer part of her. They were heavy, numb blocks of meat that throbbed with a dull, sickening heat. This was the visceral reality of the High Sierra, a slow dismantling of the human frame, piece by piece, until only the skeleton of her resolve remained. High above the canopy, the search was in full swing, but it was a tragedy of missed connections. Helicopters buzzed like angry insects over a 600-square-mile grid, their thermal sensors straining to find a heat signature in the vast, frozen wilderness. But Tiffany was a needle in a haystack made of clouds and ancient pines. The thick forest canopy acted as a shield, swallowing her shadow, while the constant storms provided a literal smokescreen for her movements. She could hear the rhythmic thrum of the rotors in the distance, a sound that should have been the music of salvation. It was the ultimate hope-crush cycle. The hum would grow louder, her heart would leap with a frantic, desperate energy, and she would wave her arms until they burned. But the sound would always fade. The mechanical bird would turn its back on her, leaving her alone in a silence so profound it felt like the weight of the mountain itself. Would you have been able to keep your sanity as the only sound of rescue drifted away into the clouds? Many would have collapsed there, letting the snow become their shroud, but Tiffany opened her journal instead. She recorded the storms, the hunger, and the phantom pulse of the helicopters, anchoring her mind to the page so it wouldn't drift away into the whiteout. She was a woman driven on the rims, her body failing but her spirit refusing to yield to the clown show of a search effort that couldn't see her. The mountain was testing her, peeling back the layers of the traveling technician from Georgia to see what was underneath. What it found was someone who refused to die quietly. The slope of Kaiser Pass rose before her like a wall of white iron, a 9,000-foot barrier that stood between Tiffany and the possibility of life. By now, the electric bike was a ghost of the past, abandoned at a trailhead sign as a useless skeleton of metal in a world that only recognized bone and sinew. Her legs, once the tools of a competitive athlete, were now mechanical instruments of agony, held together by strips of a torn shirt and the sheer vibrating force of her will. Every step upward was a negotiation with gravity, a slow-motion battle where the reward for success was simply the right to take one more breath. The snow was no longer just a weather event. It was a physical weight, 10 to 12 feet deep in places, threatening to swallow her whole with every misstep. Hunger had moved past the stage of a sharp pain and settled into a hollow, echoing vibration that hummed in her ears. The wild leeks she pulled from the frozen earth were the only things keeping her heart beating, their pungent, onion-like taste becoming the very flavor of her existence. She would chew them slowly, forcing the bitter juice down a throat that felt like it had been lined with sandpaper. To wash them down, she brewed a desperate tea of manzanita and pine needles over small, flickering fires that struggled to survive the thin air. The steam would hit her face, a fleeting ghost of warmth that vanished the moment she pulled the cup away. It was a visceral reality that no amount of training could prepare you for. The moment when you realize your body is beginning to consume itself to keep the furnace running. As she ascended into the thinning atmosphere of the high Sierra, the line between the physical world and the theater of her mind began to fray at the edges. The silence of the high peaks was so absolute that it became a deafening roar, a silence of the tomb that made her own pulse sound like a hammer against an anvil. To fight the encroaching madness, she spoke to the trees, to the wind, and most importantly, to her journal. She wrote with a frantic intensity, the pen scratching across the paper as if the ink itself were a lifeline tethering her to the woman who had left Georgia for a simple vacation. She was driving on the rims now, her physical reserves depleted, her mind beginning to flicker like a candle in a drafty room. The adrenaline of the ascent brought with it a strange, jagged hysteria. She found herself laughing at the absurdity of her situation. A dialysis technician who knew exactly how the human body failed, watching her own systems shut down in real time. She had attempted 5 calls to 911, 5 digital screams into the void that were met with the cold, no service icons of a dead world. Then came the navigation miracle, or perhaps the ultimate irony. Her phone wouldn't call for help, but it suggested a Starbucks 18 miles away. It was a taunt from a civilization that felt a million miles distant. Yet she used that digital ghost as a compass. She wasn't chasing coffee. She was chasing the direction of humanity, pushing her broken knees toward a destination that her rational mind knew might not even exist. The 13th heavy snowstorm hit as she reached the higher elevations, a blinding sheet of white that erased the horizon and turned the world into a featureless void. The wind was a predatory animal, howling through the pass and stripping away the last of her body heat. This was the unforgiving place, the locals warned about, a landscape that didn't hate her but simply didn't recognize her right to exist. She was a statistical anomaly moving through a graveyard of ice. Would you have kept moving when the snow reached your waist and your splinted leg felt like it was being twisted by a vice? Tiffany didn't have the luxury of the question. She only had the ascent and the terrifying realization that she was climbing toward a peak that offered no guarantee of a way down.